Good afternoon and welcome to our local infrastructure hub. I'm Tom Cochran, the CEO and Executive Director of the United States Conference of Mayors here in Washington. Our session today is co-hosted by the U.S. Conference of Mayors and Results for America and is supported by our funders, Bloomberg Philanthropists, Walmart Group, Emerson Collective, Ford Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation. And our topic is the Changing and Fueling Infrastructure Program at the Department of Transportation and the Department of Energy. Through President Biden's leadership, the bipartisan infrastructure law provides $7.5 billion to jumpstart the electrification of the U.S. transportation. One of the most transformative objectives within the law is that $2.5 billion of these funds are devoted to competitive grants that cities can apply for, directly. Today, we'll hear from a powerful group of officials who will be able to answer your questions on this important program. Our goal is to provide you information that will help you submit high-quality proposals. I want to thank Gabe Klein, the Executive Director of the U.S. Joint Office of Transportation and Energy, Andrew Wishona, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate, and of course, Andrew Rogers, Deputy Administration for the Federal Highway Administration. And we will also hear from Sacramento, Mayor Darrell Steinberg, about his work on electric vehicle charging. Our MC today is Michelle Joland of the Results for America and Katie Robinson, Vice President of the Electrification Coalition. They will moderate. We want to thank all of you for being with us. To start us off, we'll hear from Gabe Amo, a Special Assistant to President Biden, the Deputy Director of the White House Office of Intergovernmental Relations. Gabe is our friend. We've been with him since the beginning. We're so pleased to have him again today. Gabe, thank you for your incredible support for mayors across this nation and for this project and also for the United States Conference of Mayors. Gabe?
Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to some. And thank you, Tom, for that warm introduction. It is a very exciting day here at the White House, especially because of the topic that we're discussing today. As part of the president's goal of having 50% of all new vehicle sales be electric by 2030, today here at the White House, we've announced the first set of public and private commitments to support the country's historic transition to electric vehicles under the EV Acceleration Challenge. The challenge was launched on March 8th and is part of the president's Investing in America agenda to spur domestic manufacturing, strengthen supply chains, boost U.S. competitiveness, and create good-paying jobs. And so this is due in part to the Inflation Reduction Act and all of the investments that we're set to unleash. And because of the president's leadership and historic investments, electric vehicles sales have tripled, and the number of publicly available charging ports has grown by over 40% since he took office. There are now more than 3 million EVs on the road and over 132,000 public EV chargers across the country. And we're going to hear from some great leaders on this topic on this call. But as part of this challenge to both the private sector and the public sector, we encourage you leaders at the local level to make your commitments at cleanenergy.gov on how you will transform your fleets locally and contribute to these efforts. We're focused really on 4 primary categories as we think about this challenge. One, that's tools and resources. That's working with you all and seeing how you're developing tools and interactive resources that will help consumers, businesses, and folks in government understand and access EV incentives and make informed new and used car buying decisions that consider electric options. The second is consumer education. That's the role that a lot of you have in your communities, which is increasing awareness amongst the public, especially with groups who have low rates of adoption and can use your platforms to share how EVs work and the benefits that they offer. The third area is EV fleet expansion, and that's what I referenced previously, that you using your purchasing power to expand the fleets that you have in local government, and then community charging, which we'll hear from some of our experts on, but that will provide an opportunity to make this an easy transition, both for you and governments and the people in your communities. And so with that, I want to thank you for all of the efforts you on this call. Really make me have one of the best jobs here at the White House because of the transformational change that you're leading in partnership with the Biden-Harris administration as we make real critical investments across this country that will last for years and years to come. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and turn it over to Tom, and I hope everybody has a very informative and productive call.
Thank you very much, Gabe. Our next speaker, please come in.
It's now over to me, Michelle Jolin, from the CEO and co-founder of Results for America, and it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much, Gabe. So important to understand everything the White House and this administration is doing to promote this historic investment in electric vehicle infrastructure. So super helpful to have you lay out the current exciting announcements and progress. So for today's local infrastructure hub session, we're very excited to hear from experts about the recently released electric vehicles NOFO, and specifically the best strategies for securing funding for an equitable electric vehicle program in your city. To discuss this recently announced electrical vehicle charging grant opportunity that was in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have with us today Gabe Klein, who's the Executive Director of the U.S. Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. We have Andrew Rogers, who is the Deputy Administrator of the Federal Highway Administration. And we have Andrew Wishnia, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy at the Department of Transportation. And our moderator for this great panel is going to be Katie Robinson, who is the Vice President of the Electrification Coalition. This Electrification Coalition, as you probably know, is a national nonpartisan organization that promotes policies and actions that will facilitate the deployment of plug-in EVs on a mass scale, which is something we're all driving toward and excited to hear more about. So Katie, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate it. Again, I'm Katie Lineweaver Robinson. I'm the Vice President of the Electrification Coalition. Before my role with the EC, I served 2 governors and 3 mayors, most recently Mayor Joe Hogsett in Indianapolis, where I was the Director of Sustainability. So for so many of you on this call, I have been in your seat and have a great, tremendous respect for the work that you are doing. And I can certainly relate to the collective excitement and maybe just a smidge of anxiety that you might have right now as we are approaching that May 31st deadline. But I can promise you that if there's nothing else that you walk away from, I want you to feel confident that all of these organizations that are represented today have the resources that you need to be successful in that submission. So I am thrilled to be here today with all of you. I'm coming off of a dynamic conference that the EC hosted with our sister organization, SAFE, where we hosted world leaders and automakers, infrastructure and mineral experts to level set on where the entire EV market is at the moment. Some of those that are on our panel, including Gabe Klein, was there yesterday. Really appreciate the participation. And I certainly look forward to bringing the conversation that we were having earlier this week to that local level. Look, our EV moment is now, and I believe it to be a privilege to serve in this capacity and have a front row seat to the extraordinary public and private investments that are underway. And as Michelle introduced, we are so fortunate to have our federal partners here with us today. And before starting the panel, I do want to just do a quick level set on how we arrived at this catalytic flashpoint. Many of these folks in this call are the innovators behind the policies and actions that are going to electrify our nation's transportation system. The passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act opened the door. Actually, I'm going to take that back. It opened the floodgates for the public transportation electrification moment. Together, these two pieces of legislation make over $155 billion available for cities and states to electrify. This is 30 times more than the previous federal investments. And we've already seen local governments, we're going to hear from Sacramento later, championing these funds by deploying more chargers and light and heavy duty vehicles into their fleets. These two historic pieces of legislation have been met with commitments from state and local governments meant to complement efforts and capitalize on those investments. These public investments from both the federal and state and local governments show that this is a priority on all levels. In addition to the public investment in EVs, we have seen unprecedented investment and innovation from our industry partners. Our estimates indicate that a combined $223 billion commitment from the industry side of the house to electrify. I share these numbers with you today to demonstrate the immense opportunity ahead of us, not to increase anybody's anxiety, but to increase the excitement. Before I hand it over to our panelists, I will take a moment to just set the stage around CFI. That's the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grants. The bipartisan infrastructure law included $7.5 billion for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI program. This funding is set to build up the nation's first public charging network and will be deployed directly to 52 jurisdictions over 5 years. To gain access to funding, each of the 52 jurisdictions submitted plans that would proving that people are ready to meet the moment nationwide. The CFI program is set to complement NEVI funds and will provide an additional $2.5 billion to deploy public chargers. That's going to be over 2 different grant periods. The CFI program includes 2 funding streams, which we're going to dive into here in a moment. One is focused on community and charging, and one is on corridor charging. Through each stream, there is distinct eligibility for public entities that use both grant funding opportunities in one application, allowing funding to move further and faster. So I'm going to jump into questions, but really quick, I want to turn to Andrew Rogers. Andrew, I need you to put some guardrails up today about what questions are appropriate, what can we ask, and where do we might need to steer a little bit clear of, just so that we make sure that we're getting the right information to folks today.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Tom, and thanks everyone for the opportunity today. I was most recently Chief Counsel at Federal Highways, and it's a hat that people keep asking me to put back on for conversations just as this. But the bottom line here is we are in an open application period, so you can't ask questions like, will you give us a grant on this project? But certainly questions, and I'm seeing the chat right now, are filled with excellent questions that are going to be common to all applicants, that are going to be common amongst many cities, and that's absolutely fair game for conversation. If you're going to ask a question specific to your jurisdiction or your state law, obviously we can't and won't be able to opine on that. And candidly, a lot of the ones I'm seeing here are probably conversations for your governor's office. But we don't want to make this hard. The goal of today's conversation, the goal of these grants is to make them accessible. And so if you think that there's some question that we're dancing around the answer to, ask it another way, because the goal at the end of today and at the end of this application period is to have worthy applicants to fund.
Excellent. That's super helpful. So as a former city staffer, my sort of question out of the gate, and I talked a little bit to Gabe about this yesterday, is every city is a little bit of a unicorn when it comes to procurement strategies. I am curious, can you offer some good guidance around the complex nature that cities may face when it comes to procurement? And I recognize that we might have to talk about this a little holistically, and how cities can show in good faith that they intend to use a private partner for their competitive application, even though they may not be able to name the specific partner. So I guess the second part of this question is how detailed do cities need to be, or how finalized do those proposals need to be upon submission?
Was that for Andrew, correct, Katie?
Like that's going to be for Andrew, yes.
Okay. It felt like a little bit of a jump ball.
Gabe's like, nope.
So I'll try not to give the lawyer's response here, but it's going to get a little lawyer here for a second. So obviously federal law authorizes state and local governments to procure projects either through a traditional low bid process or through the establishment of a public-private partnership. But CFI is a little unique here because on the corridor side of the program, and if I need to back up, I will, but on the corridor side of the program, which is the $1.25 billion that's available to fund chargers along highways through discretionary grants, there's a requirement, not just an allotment, a requirement that applicants partner with the private sector. In other words, come to the table with your partner in hand and tell us what it is you're going to build. That requirement is not included in the community charging program, the other $1.25 billion. And so, although I can't tell you today exactly how specific you need to be, there will be daylight between the specificity that is necessary for a corridor charging program where it's in statute, as opposed to a community charging program where if you're bringing a private partner to the table, we want to know that, but we may not need to know nearly the level of specificity that an applicant would want to share on the corridor side, where we can't actually provide a grant unless we know there is a private partner that's ready to go.
That's very helpful, Andrew, and I'm sure there's going to be some follow-up questions in the chat that that hopefully we can get to here momentarily. Gabe, I'm going to turn it to you here. Can you, and this is a big question, but can you give us a high-level overview in your sort of where you sit of the EV landscape, how CFI sort of plays into that as a grant opportunity, and then layering on top of that, the administration's overarching vision for EV infrastructure?
Wow. Yeah. That is big. Well, first of all, thank you, Katie. Why don't I just give a 30-second overview of what the joint office is, because we are new. I'm in almost my seventh month. The office has been around for about 14 months. And so we are here as a sort of multi-agency office. The first time the federal government has worked to put an office in place to span multiple agencies. And I would say very humbly that we are a part of DOT and a part of DOE, and we work side by side. And I think very much there's a recognition in the bipartisan infrastructure law that we need to break down silos and really take an all of government approach. And I've been talking a lot about an all of society approach, because beyond just charging and clean fuels and hydrogen and all of those things, we're really talking about reinventing the economy and many parts of the workforce as well around renewable energy and electrification and clean fuels, which is a big departure from the last 125 years, where we really built the economy on the back of fossil fuels. So our job is in many ways to provide technical assistance, policy support. We work closely with Andrew Rogers, Andrew Wishnia on the formulation of whether it's CFI grants, whether it's the minimum standards, which are really crucial for states and cities and jurisdictions to be able to put out these RFPs. So that's a little bit about what we do. There's much more, and you can go to driveelectric.gov to learn about that. Soon, I think we'll have rideelectric.gov. So we're not just about driving, we're also about riding as we head into the city space, which, as you can see from the chat, is crucial. And I think this administration, in terms of the overarching goals, there's a real recognition that this administration is committed to fighting climate change, but that fighting climate change equals jobs, good American jobs. And I think we're doing an incredible job, really, of striking that balance. And, fighting climate change is a huge undertaking. And there was an article I read this week. I'm going to go a little bit off script. Don't worry, Andrew, not too far. And it was sort of like the theme of it was, this is really hard. This electrification of this national electrification program is really hard. Should we really even try to do it? I talked about this, Katie, at SAFE yesterday or the day before. What we do best in this country is things that are really hard. And we can do this. We can execute it. We can give our children cleaner air to breathe. We can be multimodal. We can be context sensitive. We can electrify rural suburban, exurban, and urban. And, one of the messages that I wanted to try to get across today is that we are going to do it all. And we're already seeing the fruits of that labor, as my counterpart Gabe, and I do want to know, when you have two Gabes on a webinar, it means automatic success of the webinar. It's very rare, but it does happen. But as Gabe said, EV sales have tripled since President Biden took office. The number of publicly available charging ports has grown by over 40%. And he said we have 130,000 public chargers. We're actually close to 140,000, right? And then, of course, you have the electrification of everything else, right? You've got transit, and there's $5.6 billion for transit through FTA. You've got $5 billion for school buses. As evidence from the chat, there's a great level of interest in electrification for bicycles and scooters, right? And so we're talking about a very context-sensitive approach. We're focused on, with the NEVI program, with CFI, there's definitely a light-duty vehicle approach. But we recognize there's, as you said, there's what, $155 billion. There's the opportunity to marry up a lot of different funding streams to accomplish what you on the call want to accomplish, whether you're in a small town in rural America on an Indian reservation or in New York City or Washington, D.C., right? And we get that. And you can come to us and we will provide assistance and work with you. Some of it is proactive. You can tune into webinars, but you can come to us with any question you have, and we will find the answer for you within government, whether it's in DOT, DOE, EPA, or somewhere else. And I'll pause there because I hopefully covered a lot of the expanse of your question.
That is absolutely perfect. And since we don't have the other Andrew on, I'm going to still put this in the Andrew category, though.
We do actually.
We do.
He should be here.
He's lingering.
He's lingering.
Andrew Wishnia, come in. Earth to Andrew. Well, maybe he left.
This Andrew will do his level best to help.
If he happens to be listening, or if one of you would like to take this, that would be great. But some of the questions that we're getting often when we talk to cities is to offer a little bit of context and clarity around the existing NOFO and how it differentiates between the alt fuel corridors and what cities should consider when deciding which grant best meets their needs.
Yeah, I'll start unless Andrew Wishnia interrupts. Gabe, feel free to jump in on anything I miss. So we get this question a lot, actually, and candidly, it is a little confusing because a few months ago, or more than a few months ago now, a year ago, we put out the first rounds of formula funding under the NEVI program, which is really designed intentionally to build out this sort of national network, backbone of interstate travel. And in fact, the requirements for those formula dollars are along alternative fuel corridors, which state designates, or along an interstate and every 50 miles and within 1 mile of the interstate. So it's very deliberate to really serve that helps solve for range anxiety and to serve interstate travel. Conversely, there is a seemingly similar provision included in the CFI program that is also for quote unquote highway charging or alternative fuel corridor charging. A key difference, I think, between the formula funds, which flow through states, and the CFI funds, which flow through states, cities, counties, tribes, territories, a host of other entities, is maybe you get along fabulously with your state DOT in terms of determining what the most appropriate transportation solution is in a given jurisdiction. Or maybe you're not first out the gate, but you're going to be up soon. This is another crack at determining where along your highways, where along your interstates might be the best next location to solve for those charging needs, but moreover, to also perhaps provide a different type of charging solution. I could just read, maybe I won't, but I could read and answer some of these questions in the chat because they're fabulous. And it's great that you're thinking about this program the way we are, which is we have a few ideas. And in fact, in the NOFO, we put together a couple of use cases that we think make sense. But what I'm so excited about on May 30th is that we're going to get a whole host of new ideas that you've all thought of, charging solutions that you're bringing to the table, and whether that is in a community and it's serving a multimodal hub, or you're doing curbside charging or pole-based charging, or you're still doing highway charging, but maybe it's solving for a different need. Maybe it's depot charging. Maybe you're solving for fleets. Maybe it's more heavy duty focused. There's a lot of opportunity out there. And this, unlike the formula program, which, we encourage the conversations and we want to see state DOTs doing that. This gives cities really an opportunity and the flexibility to solve for those same needs, but maybe in a slightly different way that makes more sense for Baltimore or Cincinnati or Houston, as opposed to Texas or Ohio or Maryland. And that's just one of I think the key differences here, and why we're excited that we get to try to solve this EV charging puzzle so many different ways. But Andrew, Gabe, you may have more thoughts here.
I'm so sorry I'm running behind from one event to another, but Katie, thanks so much for having us. And thanks for, Tom's leadership, Dave's leadership, and all of the mayors that have joined us on this call. I mean, I think one message we want to convey, notwithstanding all of the work that we have ahead of us, is we made it. After years of talk, we now have a notice of funding opportunity on the street just for you. And that is infused with the president's, vision and values of having a convenient, accessible, reliable, and above all, equitable charging infrastructure network. And so as a corollary to the alternative fuel corridor discretionary grants, we now have an opportunity to supplement those grants with grants in urban cores, in rural areas, in underserved areas, overburdened areas. There's an enormous opportunity to work directly with you all and ensure that that we have a charging infrastructure that connects, the fabric of America where it matters most. And so, one thing that we're absolutely cognizant of is the statutory requirements, the priorities, the considerations. And as a result, we want to make sure that we are working with all of you, because we know that we're going to get a lot of applications, but to the extent that we can get applications that have some symbiosis, that have been vetted with Gabe and his team at the joint office, that have that subject matter expertise already sort of underpinned, that is going to be critical to make sure that we have a charging infrastructure that works for all.
And I might just add on to that, I don't think you mentioned this, Andrew Rogers, that a lot of effort was put into this to make sure that if an application came in and, it seemed more appropriate for the community side, but actually it fits more with the corridor side, Federal Highways retains the right to say, let's move it over here. And that there's like is it a $500,000 minimum on the community grants, and a $15 million, not a $15 maximum, a $15 million maximum. That limitation does not apply. I think I forget the lower limit, but there's no upper limit on the corridor grants. And then the other thing to note is that NEVI, obviously, not only being formula, but was very prescriptive in terms of minimum standards, great minimum standards, by the way. But this applies to, primarily DC fast chargers until you get to fully built out status. There's a recognition that in different contexts, and I come from a city DOT and state DOT background, that the context is different. And there may be more of a need for level 2 chargers rather than DC fast chargers. And in the work that we've been doing with the labs to study, where we think this is all going to shake out in terms of uptake of vehicles and chargers, there's a recognition that there will be many, many more level 2 chargers, which also happen to be much less expensive, less strain on the grid, faster to install. And then the last thing I would just say is as Andrew Rogers said, the NOFO that came out, a lot of work was done on that, a lot of back and forth to make sure that people understood how creative they could be. and to stimulate that creativity with the applications without being prescriptive. And that's, I think, one of the best parts of it.
Thank you for that perspective. I think that's super helpful. Before we turn, we've got such great questions happening. And thank you to my colleague, by the way, Matt Stevens-Rich, who is our Director of Technical Services. He is helping to populate the chat. I am not that magical. But before we transition, I do want to ask, and Andrew Rogers can tell me no, but can you give us a window into what would constitute a high quality proposal, or maybe the opposite, of what some components would disqualify a proposal or be significant mark against it? So just to lead it a little bit further, you all sort of were talking about this idea, this concept of cohorts, perhaps even regionalism, cooperation. Maybe that helps to get this in the right space.
I actually would love the opportunity to answer particularly that second question, because what happens so often is we publish a NOFO and then we just sort of cross our fingers and hope. And what happens far too frequently, you'd be surprised, the most common reason that an application fails is not because it couldn't have been eligible. It's because whole portions were just omitted.
Mm-hmm.
Please answer the questions. Please answer all of the questions. It is very difficult for the review team to assign a value to your commentary on workforce development that'll be inherent in your project if you don't talk about workforce. Now, if there's nothing to say in that category, okay, please at least tell us that. But you would really be surprised at the number of applications that, notwithstanding their otherwise excellent attributes, fail on candidly technical issues that we don't want to see be the reason that any of these applications wouldn't go forward. To Gabe's point, though, we really aren't trying to make this difficult. The purpose of this program, specifically the community charging side of the CFI program, is to bring under-resourced, non-traditional applicants into the fold. That is why we're doing this. And so we will be as lenient as we possibly can in helping folks get over the finish line. We do have an opportunity through our NOFOs to do something called lookbacks, where we can, through a host of applications that maybe suffer a similar flaw, ask all of those similarly situated applicants the same question in order to try to get them over the finish line and get them into consideration. In terms of the first half of your question, and I'll be brief here because I know my colleagues have thoughts, we try to sort of paint a roadmap. There's a couple of key administration priorities that are inherent in most of our NOFOs that I think the EV charging landscape solves for almost organically. And that's, again, one of the beauties of this infrastructure and this type of a program. But to the extent that applicants can really lean in on those key areas, which are very clearly identified in the NOFO, and tell us your story, you'll score well. You'll be a highly competitive applicant that will get all due consideration when we're making those final calls. I fully expect, candidly, that when we're in the final stages of reviewing applications, it's not going to be a situation where we're scrounging for applications to put forward, but rather making really difficult choices, picking amongst favorites, and trying to decide what is a fair and equitable distribution of these finite resources.
That was extremely helpful. Thank you for that. Gabe, did you have some additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, and actually, Andrew Wishnanu, you're on mute. Do you want to go, and I can go after? Okay.
Yeah, just very briefly, Katie, you had mentioned cohorts, and Andrew followed that. I know that's something that a lot of mayors on the call are thinking about. You know, one unique aspect of the community grants in particular is, in addition to all of the public eligibilities, the last clause of the eligibilities refers to the fact that essentially, if anyone puts an application together with a group of other entities, that's also an eligible group. And that's something that, you know, would obviously benefit network connectivity, would benefit, you know, the vision and values that we're trying to uphold in terms of having a safe, you know, accessible, reliable, equitable network. And I think something that we would encourage, I think if Michael Barabee, our DOE, counterpart was on the line, he would be boosting the Clean Cities coalitions. And so, just working through those Clean Cities coalitions and working with your counterparts on this call, that's enormously helpful as well. Gabe, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We saw that with the SMART grants, and I think it's worked really well. And I think as a former city DOT chief, like anytime you can work with other cities, because everybody is short-staffed. Let's be honest. A lot of cities haven't recovered from the 2008 financial crisis in terms of headcount, and so the more we can share resources, come up with great applications. And then have a cohort to sort of work through the details. I think that's smart, just as a practitioner in a city. And then the other thing I would just add is the other bit of language that's important is after completing the merit review, DOT will prioritize highly recommended projects and recommended projects that demonstrate exceptional benefits under merit criteria number 3, equity, community engagement, and Justice 40. Merit criteria number 4, which Andrew Rogers touched on, workforce development, job quality, and wealth creation, or merit criteria number 5, CFI program vision. And then, prompts to rural areas as well as low and moderate income neighborhoods. And I think one that's really important in 3 is within communities with a low ratio of private parking spaces to households or a high ratio of multi-unit dwellings to single family homes. So a real recognition that the early adopters of EVs were going out and buying them and often charging at home. And that as we expand to cities and there's a lot of shared use activity, or people need to own a vehicle, but in a multi-unit complex, that's going to be different. So I think to Andrew Rogers' point, like digging into the NOFO and really, really looking at it and then answering all the questions will be important. Well, crucial, actually.
Well, thank you for that. That's super helpful. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into some of our public Q&A. We are extremely fortunate to have Mayor Rhodes Conway, Chair of Climate Mayors, on today. So, Mayor, I'd like to have you open it up and give us our first question, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Katie, and great to see both the Gabes and both the Andrews. I don't know how you all managed that. I'm Satya Rhodes Conway. I'm the mayor of Madison, Wisconsin, and the chair of Climate Mayors. Thanks so much for this session. My question is about sort of levels of partnership. And so I know that one of the things that's anticipated is potentially, just for example, a city partnering with a private entity that would actually be responsible for installing the charging infrastructure. What I wonder is, can we add in another level of partnership with, for example, local small businesses or nonprofit organizations that might host charging infrastructure? And can we anticipate a business model where they would actually be able to benefit in some ways from the fees paid for the charging, so that we could be lifting up our community in different ways? And so that may be a little out of the box, but I have questions about that. And then I just want to add my voice to all the people who are asking about, can we use this for e-bikes also?
Andrew, you jumped off mute. I thought you were going to take it.
I'm happy to take a shot, and then you can give me the legal answer that that backtracks.
Aren't you both lawyers, though?
Yeah, but only one of us is practicing right now.
That's true.
Mayor Rhodes Conway, it's great to see you. Thanks for your leadership, and thanks so much for the question. The way that the grants are written is that an entity eligible to receive a grant are essentially public entities. So my sense is that the innovative partnerships that you're talking about wouldn't be precluded, so long as they're not the entity that's actually receiving the grant. But if a philanthropy, wants to support the grant, wants to work in partnership with a public entity, I think that's the type of innovative relationship oftentimes that can make a ton of sense. Obviously, I think like working with Gabe and the joint office and and Gabe would work, across the federal family to make sure that we have the right kind of technical expertise to make sure that we're running the traps on what works and what doesn't. And obviously Andrew and FHWA's leadership on sort of the legal questions, depending on the fact pattern, that would be super helpful. But I think broadly speaking, Mayor Rhodes Conway, that's exactly the type of kind of forward thinking that we're looking for.
Yeah, and just to tag on to that, Andrew's absolutely right. And I think putting my technical assistance hat on, I'm not just talking about CFI grants, just in general, I would encourage you to think about just the long-term sustainability of the operating model. We've had some challenges with car sharing and bike sharing across the country when there's a nonprofit that's actually the operator. It's not that it can't work, but just thinking about how that partnership fits together. And we're happy to not only give you some assistance, but we're actually hiring a senior advisor for business models and finance that should be on very soon. And we're really delving into public-private partnerships and contracting at the state and local level. We just had a webinar the other day, actually on contracting and procurement with some state and local jurisdictions, and we'll be doing more of that. So we recognize that a lot of the questions are going to come down to the how. How do you do this? How do you do it effectively? How do you do it not just so you get things in the ground, but that they provide long-term benefits, ancillary benefits also, and that you have that sort of mix of community stakeholders involved. And I think there's a way to do it that also preserves the sort of financial stability or sets it up to be financially stable over the long term. And there is funding, obviously, for maintenance and operations of the stations for a number of years. But then, of course, you want to make sure that you have a way to keep it going on an ongoing basis.
And thank you both so much. I really appreciate it. And let me just invite all of the cities on the call to engage with Climate Mayors. If your mayor is not already a member, please join, because we have had many conversations with Andrew Wishnia in the past, and anticipate, I hope, Gabe, having conversations with you in the future about these issues. So invite folks to join us.
Mayor, if I can just touch on one other thing I think I heard you ask that I'm quite confident will be of interest to all of the mayors, which is the idea of profitability and incentives for non-eligible entity partners. For the NEVI program, there's actually in statute a requirement, or an allotment, I should say, where a reasonable rate of return on investment of any private person financing an EV charging station, as determined by the state DOT, is specifically allowable. So NEVI funded chargers are it's not just probably a good idea in terms of a negotiation with a private entity that you may be partnering with, it's specifically allowed under statute. For the grant dollars, it's slightly different in that there's not a specific statutory requirement or guardrails around the provision of a reasonable rate of return on investment. But that certainly is something that in your procurement and in your contracting with those entities, I suspect would be negotiated, and it is going to be a familiar negotiation for many of those site hosts and charging providers, because they'll be having those same conversation with your state DOTs. So I just wanted to put that out there to make folks aware of there is this really, we tend not to return investment on roads and bridges, I guess, unless there's a toll attached to it. And this infrastructure is very different in which there's an investment being made where there's actually an opportunity to see a real return in real time on that investment, and don't want the mayors to come out of this meeting not being aware of that opportunity.
All right, any other additional comments on the mayor's question?
Well, I might make one more, and that's, she asked about, e-bikes and that sort of thing. And obviously, I mean, we're selling more e-bikes, I think, in this country now than e-cars, right? So that's a really important and valid question. And we have some great examples from the past, when I ran the Chicago DOT and we set up Divvy and we applied for, we used CMAQ money to set up bike share. We applied for before raise grants. I forget what the program is called, but grants to locate bike share stations at our CTA stations. And so thinking about mixing and matching funding stream important. And then I would just say that we really are emphasizing this dig once approach. So, if in one curbside charging station, how about thinking about the duct bank and the stubbing out for the entire block? How about thinking about what you're going to need in the futures and bikes for transit? And so that idea of integrated planning, I think, is important. And we would rather that you build once rather than come back and sorry if I just froze, but then if you had to come back and sort of dig up the street twice.
This is such a good and rich discussion. So thank you. I want to just jump in here now and move on to our mayor. Mayor Steinberg is here from Sacramento, who is going to be talking to us about EV infrastructure, charging infrastructure, and how it's being implemented on the ground. And Katie's got some good questions for him. So can we bring you in now, Mayor Steinberg?
I'm right here. Nice to be with everybody.
Thank you.
Hello, Mayor. It's a pleasure to have you. And thank you to the Andrews. Thank you to the Gabes. We so appreciate what you're doing on behalf of all of us. And certainly just as a quick note before we chat into this discussion, my team is working to download the questions, and we're going to do our best to make sure if we've not responded to all of them in real time that we do try to get to them as quickly as possible. So more to come there, but let's shift gears and go to Sacramento. And Mayor, I'm going to do a quick level set of some of the extraordinary work that you have been doing over the last 7 or so years. But the city of Sacramento is in phase 2, is my understanding, of a nearly 7-year or so effort to change the entire mobility landscape in Sacramento through EVs and other ZEV initiatives. We were just talking about e-bikes moments ago. In 21, the city of Sacramento received a $1.8 million grant to bring EV programs to community centers, libraries, really boosting Sacramento's goal of becoming California's ZEV capital. The project is investing nearly $3 million into Sacramento neighborhoods when combined with match funds. And I believe you got that grant from the California Energy Commission, which, of course, for those that aren't familiar, is a state policy and planning agency. But they're going to fund that EV charger installation, the car and bike share programs, and also including public art, which I think is really great. But through 2024, the EV Blueprint Implementation Project is going to increase public charging infrastructure at community-facing facilities, as I mentioned, really focusing on building out relationships and implementing highly localized outreach, education, and engagement, which is essential in these efforts, increase equity and address frontline community needs with ZEV technologies, and identify and test technologies, partnership models, and programs. So really bringing that smart city layer to this. So Mayor, getting to my questions, if you don't mind, just jumping right on in. Clearly, Sacramento is focused on driving innovation in the EV space and putting charging as a priority, including launching the new ZEV transit and car share travel options. I feel like I'm listing all of your accomplishments, by the way.
Please, just keep going.
I know you're right. Like let's just make it happen here. Launching Clean Cars for All program that directs incentive funding to low-income households, securing the grant award to build out further EV programming. When you take that moment to reflect on the success and sort of reaching that moment where you are that ZEV capital, what elements and achievements stand out most to you, if I haven't listed them all?
Well, there was one that you sort of referenced that I think has really been a catalyst for us, and that is competing to be the green city under the Air Resources Board Electrify America settlement. You know, this was the Volkswagen settlement where they formed a subsidiary called Electrify America that, as part of the settlement, was charged with implementing EV solutions throughout the country and the world. And so we won the competition in California to be selected as the green city. And it wasn't just a nice plaque. It came with $40 million. And that really drove our car sharing evolution here. We're at 70 lower income housing complexes, apartment complexes where there are EVs available for rideshare that people can take and use at very, very low rates. And so that was, I think, a major catalyst for believing we could find ourselves leading in all of these spaces. But I will tell you why. I mean, I'd like to say it was all about the great mayor, but it was not. It's about the fact that the city, the constituency really wants this. That's really what's happening. I think that's sometimes a missing element here, that your city really needs to want it. I mean, we have sold in the city and county of Sacramento 9,000 zero emission vehicles, just people buying thousands of zero emission vehicles for themselves. And that's a sign. Our city fleet is 50% zero emission. And so we also are the capital city of California, which is not a coincidence here in terms of our work here, because California has been, of course, on the forefront of the climate change fight, and the state through the governor and the legislature have also put significant resources into having California lead the way. And so we're far from done, obviously, because we still have congestion on our freeways. We still have too many people not taking advantage of transit or zero emission vehicle options. But I think we're starting something that is very, very different. It's amazing to me too, and I know this isn't unique to Sacramento, but throughout the country, younger people, I used to be one of them, but younger people now don't seem as inclined to want to have their own car. There's a lot more people. Our downtown is building out in a major way, more housing starts than ever before, and people are walking and people are biking, and so the generation, I think, is changing the behavior and creating the opportunities as well, because they don't want it the way that it was.
I think that's right, Mayor. And I think it's so important. And I appreciate your leadership and making sure that people are provided with choices, clean, healthy choices for their modes of transportation. So the current EV Blueprint implementation project runs through 2024. It's really hard to believe that not only is it almost April, but 2024 is next year. As the city enters into that final stretch of the current blueprint, do you have recommendations for other cities and partners who may be starting in their own EV blueprint?
Well, I think you have to be willing to put some of your own skin in the game, as they say, right? And even, I'm still understanding the parameters of this incredible opportunity that the Biden administration and the Congress are providing to cities throughout the country, but everything involves a local match, or state or local match. I mean, the 80-20, I know that in California, that the state's not going to pick up the full 20%. I mean, there's going to be some cost sharing. And so I think you're more competitive for this money, but you also can't do it just with the federal money unless you are willing to put up some resources of your own to say that this is a priority. And everything comes back to politics in some ways, right? I use that in the positive sense of the word. Is climate a priority or is it not? Is it something that you're willing to, use some political capital? We just got through a major fight, and it was a fight around requiring the electrification of all future construction, our office buildings here in Sacramento, and phased in over time. And there was a lot of pushback, and, we prevailed and are moving forward. But it really, I think, takes a will, and certainly those reviewing grant applications want to see that a city is doing something in addition to asking for the money that says they're serious about it for the long term.
I think that makes a lot of sense, Mayor. Well, just one last question, and it's the big one. But what's next for Sacramento beyond 2024? How does the city build on the success and momentum that's been garnered?
Well, we certainly hope to be competitive for more resources because, and these federal resources, because, I mean, I think the thing I've learned in my years in government is that the best way to sustain progress and success is to not rely on just one strategy and one thing. That you have to have a multiplicity of strategies and a multiplicity of funding sources to be able to sustain these efforts. But we won't go back. We can't. The people won't let us. They will rightfully say, well, wait a minute. You can't take this away. This is too important. This is too good. And so we intend, to increase our share of public vehicles that are zero emission. We intend to provide more charging infrastructure and spread it out. Even though we're doing really well, it still isn't everywhere. And because we want more people to be purchasing zero emission vehicles who live in our city. And if they're going to do that, they're going to have to know that we are providing the infrastructure with the private sector to make sure that they can use their vehicles in a way that works for them in their lives. So we're going to keep going forward. And, we're going to be very entrepreneurial. The thing about Electrify America, of course, is those were not public funds, that was private funding. And even though it was a one-time grant, it's a lot of money, we're going to look for other opportunities to partner with the private sector and continue to lead.
Thank you for that, Mayor. Before Michelle hops in, I just want to share some appreciation for your leadership. To all the mayors on the call, thank you. To the city staff, really appreciate what you're doing. And just remember what was said earlier, cities can do hard things. We've been asked to do hard things for a number of years now. And thank you for taking up the stead and bringing that leadership. So, Michelle.
Katie, thank you. And thank you to all the mayors. And as Katie said, her team and all of our team are going to be following up on so many of the good questions that are in the chat that we haven't been able to get to. So before we wrap up today's session, as always, we want to hear from you. We're going to give you this poll that we're hoping you will fill out to give us the feedback that helps us improve. And also, I just want to make a particular point of saying, while you complete this poll, that we have heard, and we're hearing your feedback, want to acknowledge the challenges we've heard about the requirements and the timeline for preparing a competitive application for these grants. There is a lot of information to sift through. There's a lot of work to be done quickly in the next several weeks. There's a short time frame. And so we just wanted to underscore again that the local infrastructure hub is here to help. And we are encouraging you to reach out with questions. We have many resources and experts like Katie and her colleagues available to answer your questions, big and small. In partnership with the National League of Cities and Delivery Associates, we've been running these technical assistance boot camps for all cities interested in applying for these programs. So I'm happy to share these resources. There's a lot of good quality resources that can be used by everyone. We have on the slide some links, and we're hoping, in the chat that you'll, in the chat, there's a link as well. So please check them out, and please reach out if there are any questions, because we know this is an incredibly important moment with a lot to do in a short amount of time. And so the resources are there to help. So thank you again for joining us. And please join our next local infrastructure hub session. It's this Tuesday, April 4th, and we're going to be hearing from the Department of Energy and others about the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program. It's an important one. And then also on Wednesday, April 12th, we'll be exploring the sort of innovative solutions and hear from the winners of the State Safe Streets and Roads for All program. So as always, you can find more information about these upcoming sessions and all of the resources, especially on the topics we talked about today, at localinfrastructure.org. So thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session. Thank you all.